1763, London, England. To understand the American Revolution, we must first understand the crushing weight of victory. For nearly a decade, the British Empire had been engaged in a titanic struggle for global supremacy, the 7 Years' War. It was a conflict that spanned oceans, fought in the forests of North America, the plains of Europe, and the waters of the Caribbean. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, Great Britain had emerged as the undisputed master of the world. The French Empire in North America was shattered, and the British flag flew from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. But victory came with a devastating price tag. The war had been unimaginably expensive. To defend its colonies and expand its reach, the British Crown had been forced to maintain a massive standing army and a sprawling navy. The national debt had nearly doubled, skyrocketing to levels that the British Parliament deemed unsustainable. In the halls of Westminster, the mood was not one of pure celebration, but of profound fiscal anxiety. The empire was at its zenith, yet it was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. For the British government, the math was simple, if brutal. The colonies had been the primary beneficiaries of the war. It was British blood and British treasure that had cleared the French threat from the American frontier, making the land safer and more valuable for colonial settlement. Therefore, according to the logic of the imperial treasury, the colonies should bear a proportional share of the cost of their own defense. This was the cost of empire. However, there was a fundamental disconnect between London and the American colonies. To the ministers in Parliament, the debt was a matter of administrative accounting, a logistical necessity to be managed through new duties and levies. But to the colonists, these emerging financial pressures felt less like shared responsibility and more like an infringement on their rights. For decades, the American colonies had operated under a system of salutary neglect. The British government had largely left them to govern their own internal affairs and manage their own local economies. This period of autonomy had allowed a distinct colonial identity to flourish. Now, as the British government moved to tighten its grip and extract revenue to balance the books, that autonomy was being stripped away. The empire was no longer a loose collection of prosperous outposts. It was becoming a strictly managed, centralized machine. The British viewed the colonies as assets that needed to be serviced and protected. The colonists viewed themselves as Englishmen who possessed the traditional rights of subjects. Most importantly, the right to be taxed only by their own elected representatives. As the smoke cleared from the battlefield of the 7 Years' War, a new, more insidious conflict was beginning to brew. It wasn't a conflict of bayonets and muskets, but one of ledgers and laws. The British Empire had won the war, but in doing so, it had created a financial burden so immense that it would inadvertently trigger the collapse of its most valuable holdings. The debt incurred to secure the American frontier was about to become the very catalyst that would sever the colonies from the crown forever. October 7, 1763, London, England. While the British Parliament scrambled to balance the imperial ledgers, King George III and his advisors were confronted with a secondary, perhaps even more volatile problem: the frontier. The 7 Years' War had indeed removed the French threat from the heart of North America, but it had also left behind a chaotic and dangerous vacuum. The vast territories stretching west of the Appalachian Mountains were now a powder keg of competing interests, indigenous resistance, and colonial ambition. To the British Crown, the situation was a logistical nightmare. The empire was broke, yet it was now responsible for defending a massive, sprawling frontier against a coalition of Native American tribes, most notably the Algonquian-speaking peoples, who were fiercely resisting the encroachment of white settlers. The cost of maintaining a standing army in these remote wildernesses was an expense the treasury simply could not afford. The solution, from the perspective of London, was a strategic retreat. On October 7, the royal proclamation was issued. It drew a literal line across the map of North America, the Proclamation Line of 1763. This boundary followed the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, declaring all lands west of that ridge to be reserved exclusively for Native American tribes. For the British, this was a pragmatic attempt to prevent costly frontier wars and to maintain a buffer zone that would keep the peace. It was an effort to stabilize an empire that was stretched to its breaking point. But to the colonists, this line was not a peace treaty, it was a betrayal. For generations, the promise of the American wilderness had been the driving force of colonial expansion. Thousands of settlers, many of whom were veterans of the very war just fought, had moved westward with the expectation that the victory over France would grant them access to the fertile valleys of the Ohio River and the vast lands of the interior. To these men and women, the land west of the mountains was their birthright, secured by their sweat and the blood of their neighbors. When the proclamation line was announced, it felt like a cage being slammed shut. The colonists saw the line as a calculated move to keep them hemmed in along the Atlantic coast, where they were easier to govern, easier to tax, and easier to control. They viewed the British government not as a protector, but as a jailer. The land they had fought to win was suddenly being held hostage by the very crown they had bled to defend. This created a profound sense of resentment that cut across class lines. Wealthy land speculators who had invested fortunes in Western territories were outraged by the loss of potential profit. Meanwhile, the common frontiersmen, many of whom were struggling to survive on small plots of land, felt their dreams of prosperity being stolen by a distant, uncaring parliament. The proclamation line transformed the political tension of the previous months into a deep-seated territorial grievance. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the fundamental right to move, to settle, and to grow. The British thought they were buying peace through restriction, but in reality, they were sowing the seeds of a much more violent defiance. The line in the dirt was about to become a fault line in the soul of the American people. March 22, 1765, Boston, Massachusetts. If the proclamation line was a cage, then the policies emerging from London were the heavy iron locks. The resentment born of territorial restriction was about to collide with a new, more direct assault on the colonial pocketbook. The British Empire was drowning in debt, and the Parliament in London, sitting thousands of miles across the Atlantic, had decided that the American colonies would be the ones to foot the bill. The first major blow landed in the form of the Stamp Act. This was not merely another custom or trade duty on imported goods. This was something fundamentally different. For the first time, the Crown was imposing a direct internal tax on the colonists themselves. Every legal document, every newspaper, every playing card, and even every pamphlet required to circulate ideas would now bear a government-mandated stamp, purchased at a premium. It was a tax on the very tools of colonial life, and perhaps more importantly, the tools of political discourse. To the British ministry, this was a matter of simple accounting, a fair contribution from subjects of the empire to pay for their own protection. But to the colonists, it was a violation of the ancient rights of Englishmen. In the halls of Westminster, the colonists had no voice. They had no representatives to argue their interests, no voices to protest the necessity of the levy, and no vote to check the power of the Treasury. This realization crystallized into a singular, thunderous rallying cry that would define a generation: no taxation without representation. The argument was not necessarily that they refused to pay taxes altogether, but rather that they refused to be taxed by a body in which they had no agency. They argued that according to the principles of the British Constitution, a man's property could not be taken from him without his consent, a consent that could only be granted through his elected representatives. By taxing them directly through a parliament in London, the Crown was, in their eyes, reducing them from free subjects to mere tenants of the state. The reaction was swift and visceral. In the streets of Boston and New York, the protest took on a physical, often violent character. The Sons of Liberty emerged from the shadows, organizing boycotts and intimidating tax collectors. Merchants refused to handle stamped goods, and the economy began to shudder under the weight of organized resistance. The very fabric of colonial society began to fray, as neighbors were divided between those who remained loyal to the Crown and those who viewed any compliance as an act of treason against their own liberty. The Stamp Act was more than a fiscal policy. It was a psychological turning point. It forced the colonists to confront a terrifying question: who truly holds sovereignty over their lives? Is it the king and his parliament, or is it the people who live, work, and die on this soil? As the protests intensified, the British response grew increasingly heavy-handed, but the damage was already done. The ideological divide had been bridged. The struggle was no longer just about the boundaries of the wilderness or the cost of a frontier war. It had become a fundamental battle over the nature of power, the definition of rights, and the very right to self-governance. The fire had been lit, and the smoke was beginning to cloud the vision of the British Empire. June 1767, Boston, Massachusetts. The fire lit by the Stamp Act had not been extinguished. It had merely changed its fuel. While the Stamp Act had been repealed in a moment of British concession, the reprieve was short-lived and deceptive. Parliament had issued a declaration asserting its right to tax the colonies in all cases whatsoever, a chilling reminder that the Crown's authority was absolute. To soothe the economic unrest without fully retreating from its authority, Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend introduced a new series of measures. These were not direct internal taxes like the Stamp Act, but rather external duties, customs duties levied on essential imported goods such as glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. To the British ministry, this was a sophisticated way to assert sovereignty while appearing to respect colonial distinctions. To the colonists, it was a distinction without a difference. It was simply a different way to reach into their pockets. The Townshend Acts acted as a catalyst for a new level of organized defiance. The colonies moved beyond mere political debate and into the realm of economic warfare. Non-importation agreements, massive, coordinated boycotts of British goods, swept through the coastal cities. Colonial women, often referred to as the Daughters of Liberty, became the backbone of this resistance, spinning their own cloth and producing domestic goods to ensure the colonies could survive without British imports. But as the economic tension tightened like a noose, the political atmosphere in Boston grew suffocating. To enforce these new laws and quell the rising tide of dissent, the British government made a fateful decision. They would send more troops. By 1768, Boston was no longer just a center of commerce. It was an occupied city. Thousands of British regulars were poured into the narrow, cobblestone streets, tasked with enforcing customs laws and maintaining order. But there was no order to be found, only friction. The presence of a standing army in a time of peace, living among a civilian population that viewed them as an invading force, created a powder keg of resentment. Every interaction between a redcoat and a colonial laborer was a potential flashpoint. The soldiers were poorly paid, often forced to take menial jobs in the city to supplement their income, which only deepened the locals' contempt for them. The tension finally reached its breaking point on the night of March 5, 1770. It began as a typical frigid Boston evening, but the air was thick with hostility. A small group of colonists began harassing a British sentry, taunting him with insults and snowballs. The cry for help went up, and soon, a squad of soldiers marched toward the fray, muskets leveled and bayonets fixed. The crowd swelled, turning from a group of hecklers into a mob shouting provocations and demanding the soldiers fire. In the chaos, confusion, and terrifying darkness of the street, a shot rang out, then another. In a matter of seconds, the cobblestones were stained with the blood of 5 colonists. The Boston Massacre, as it would later be branded by propagandists, was not just a tragic skirmish. It was a transformative event. It stripped away the illusion that the British could govern the colonies through mere legislation. It proved that the Crown was willing to use lethal force to maintain its grip, and it gave the movement for independence a set of martyrs. The blood spilled on those streets served as a grim, indelible ink, writing the next chapter of a revolution that could no longer be contained by words alone. December 16, 1773, Boston, Massachusetts. The memory of the blood spilled on the cobblestones in 1770 had not faded. It had merely simmered beneath the surface of colonial life. For 3 years, a fragile, uneasy peace held, but the underlying grievance remained. The question of who held the ultimate right to govern and tax the American people. The spark for the next explosion was not a shot, but a shipment. In an attempt to bail out the struggling East India Company, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act. While the act actually lowered the price of tea, it granted the company a monopoly and reaffirmed Parliament's authority to tax the colonies. To the merchants of Boston, this was a calculated insult, a maneuver designed to trick them into accepting the principle of taxation without representation through the lure of cheap goods. As the tea ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, sat anchored in Boston Harbor, the city held its breath. Radical leaders, led by the Sons of Liberty, issued a final ultimatum. The tea must be sent back to England or else. The British authorities, rigid and unyielding, refused to budge. On the night of December 16, the tension finally snapped. Under the cover of darkness, a group of men, some disguised in Mohawk Indian attire to shield their identities, boarded the 3 ships. There was no looting, no senseless violence, and no theft of personal property. Instead, there was a focused, symbolic destruction. With axes and heavy hammers, they smashed open hundreds of chests, dumping 342 crates of East India Company tea into the freezing waters of the harbor. The harbor turned dark with the floating wreckage of British commerce. It was a massive, expensive, and highly theatrical act of defiance. The Boston Tea Party was not a riot. It was a calculated political statement. It sent a clear message to London. The colonists would rather destroy property than submit to a tax they did not authorize. But if the colonists expected a dialogue, they were met with a hammer blow. London's response was not one of diplomacy, but of pure, unadulterated punishment. King George III and Parliament viewed the destruction of tea as an act of open rebellion that demanded a crushing response. They moved to make an example of Massachusetts, passing a series of punitive measures known in Britain as the Coercive Acts, but known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. The scale of the retaliation was unprecedented. First, the Boston Port Act effectively choked the city, closing the harbor to all commerce until the East India Company was compensated for its lost tea. This was a death sentence for the local economy. Next, the Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of its democratic rights, placing it under direct military rule and severely limiting town meetings. The Quartering Act was expanded, allowing British troops to be housed in unoccupied buildings. Finally, the administration of justice was moved from local courts to royal courts, ensuring that British officials would be tried by their own peers rather than colonial juries. The British intention was to isolate Massachusetts, to crush the spirit of rebellion, and to force the other colonies to see the cost of defiance. They believed that by tightening the noose around Boston, the rest of the colonies would recoil in fear and return to the fold of loyalty. They were catastrophically wrong. Instead of isolation, the coercive acts produced unity. The sight of a major colonial port being strangled and a community's liberties being stripped away sent a wave of shock and indignation from Massachusetts to Georgia. The intolerable acts did not break the spirit of the colonies. They forged a collective identity. The colonists began to realize that if the Crown could do this to Boston, it could do it to anyone. The time for protest was ending. The time for organized, continental resistance had begun. September 5, 1774, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The atmosphere in Philadelphia was thick with a sense of historical weight. For decades, the 13 colonies had functioned as separate entities, distinct cultures, separate economies, and often competing interests. Virginia was a land of tobacco planters, Massachusetts, a hub of maritime commerce, Pennsylvania, a diverse middle ground. They were neighbors, but they were not a nation. But as 56 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Carpenter's Hall, the era of isolation was over. They were no longer arriving merely as representatives of their individual provinces, but as a unified front against a common adversary. These men were a microcosm of the colonial leadership: lawyers, merchants, physicians, and plantation owners. Some, like John Adams of Massachusetts, were fueled by a fiery, radical indignation. Others, like moderate delegates from New York and Pennsylvania, were deeply cautious, fearing that any move too aggressive would invite a total war they were not prepared to fight. The mission of this First Continental Congress was not, at this stage, to declare independence. That would be a step too far for many in the room. Their goal was more surgical. They sought to redress grievances, to protest the intolerable acts, and to demand a return to the constitutional rights they believed they held as Englishmen. The debates inside the hall were intense and exhaustive. The delegates faced a profound dilemma: how to resist British tyranny without descending into anarchy. They had to find a way to strike at the British economy without destroying their own. After days of heated deliberation, they reached a consensus on a series of coordinated actions. First, they drafted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. This document was a sophisticated legal argument, asserting that the colonists possessed the same unalienable rights as British subjects, and that Parliament had no authority to tax them without their consent. It was a plea for justice, framed in the language of the law. Second, they organized a massive economic weapon, the Continental Association. This was a system of non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation. It was a total boycott of British goods. From the finest silks to the simplest tools, the colonists were being asked to sacrifice their standard of living to prove a political point. It was a call for radical self-reliance, turning every household in America into a frontline of economic warfare. Finally, the Congress took a step that signaled a shift from mere protest to organized defense. They advised the colonies to begin mobilizing their local militias. They were preparing for the possibility that diplomacy might fail, and that the British response would be military rather than political. As the Congress prepared to adjourn, they did something unprecedented. They agreed to meet again if the grievances remained unaddressed. They had created a shadow government, a central nervous system for a body that did not yet exist. The First Continental Congress had achieved something remarkable. They had taken 13 disparate, often clashing colonies and forced them to speak with a single, resonant voice. They had transformed a collection of grievances into a political movement. The British Crown had intended the coercive acts to isolate Massachusetts, but instead, they had inadvertently provided the catalyst for a continental union. The stage was set. The lines were being drawn. And as the delegates departed, the peace that had held the colonies together was dissolving, replaced by the gathering storm of revolution. April 18, 1775, Boston, Massachusetts. The gathering storm that the delegates in Philadelphia had sensed was no longer a metaphor. It had become a physical, suffocating reality. For months, the city of Boston had been under a state of virtual siege. British regulars, encased in their scarlet tunics, patrolled the narrow, cobblestone streets, their presence a constant, bristling reminder of the Crown's authority. But beneath the surface of this military occupation, a silent, frantic energy was pulsing through the countryside. The colonial militias, the Minutemen, were no longer just a theoretical concept discussed in halls of governance. They were real men, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, training in the moonlight, hiding muskets in haylofts, and watching the horizon. They knew the British were preparing something. They knew the tension had reached a breaking gasting point. The spark was struck in the dead of night. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, received intelligence that the provincial rebels were stockpiling gunpowder and weapons in the towns of Concord and along the roads to Lexington. To preempt a full-scale insurrection, Gage issued a secret order. On the night of April 18, columns of British regulars began their march out of Boston, moving under the cover of darkness toward their objective. But the colonies were not blind. Paul Revere, along with other riders like William Dawes, raced through the darkness. Their warning was a frantic signal to the countryside. The regulars are coming. As the sun began to rise on April 19, the colonial resistance was already mobilizing. The first encounter occurred on the outskirts of Lexington. As the morning mist clung to the fields, a small group of colonial militia stood in a thin line on the village green. They were facing the professional, battle-hardened infantry of the British Empire. The air was thick with tension. Neither side wanted to be the first to fire, yet neither could afford to retreat. Then, in a moment that has puzzled historians for centuries, a single shot rang out. The shot heard round the world was not a command, but a catalyst. In the ensuing chaos, the British regulars opened fire, and 8 Americans fell dead on the green. The political protest had officially died, replaced by the brutal reality of combat. The British forces, believing they had suppressed the rebellion, pressed onward toward Concord. But they had underestimated the scale of the resistance. As they moved through the countryside, they were no longer marching through a compliant colony, but through a gauntlet of hostility. Every woodlot, every stone wall, and every hill provided cover for colonial marksmen. When the British reached Concord, they found the militia had already begun to gather, not in organized lines, but in a swelling tide of angry, determined citizens. The skirmish at the North Bridge turned the tide. The British, once the hunters, suddenly found themselves the hunted. The retreat from Concord back to Boston became a harrowing march of survival. The British regulars, trained for open-field maneuvers, were ill-prepared for the guerrilla-style tactics of the Americans. They were pelted with stones, musketry, and arrows from the flanks, retreating in a broken column through a landscape that had turned entirely against them. The bloodshed at Lexington and Concord changed everything. The debate over taxes and rights was over. The struggle for existence had begun. The American Revolution was no longer a legal argument. It was a war. June 17, 1775, Charlestown, Massachusetts. The retreat from Concord had left the British military in a state of high agitation. While they had successfully broken the colonial spirit in the countryside, the heart of the rebellion remained a festering wound: the city of Boston itself. The British regulars had reclaimed the streets, but they were now effectively trapped within the city limits, staring across the water at an enemy that was rapidly transforming from a disorganized mob into a disciplined force. The colonial leadership, now operating out of Cambridge, realized they could not win a war of attrition against the world's most powerful navy. They needed to strike. They needed to prove that these amateurs could stand toe-to-toe with the professionals. They found their opportunity on the heights overlooking the city, Breed's Hill. In the pre-dawn darkness, under the direction of Colonel William Prescott, colonial forces moved with frantic urgency. They weren't just building a fortification, they were building a symbol. Using whatever timber and earth they could scavenge, they began to construct a redoubt on the crest of the hill. They were working against time, knowing that the British would eventually look up and see the threat rising against them. By the time the sun crested the horizon, the British command realized the gravity of the situation. General Gage, seeing the American works on the heights, could not allow them to remain. To leave those hills in rebel hands was to leave a dagger pointed at the throat of Boston. He ordered an assault. The scene that followed was one of terrifying, disciplined brutality. The British columns, dressed in their iconic scarlet, began their advance across the open ground. They moved with the precision of a machine, stepping in rhythm, their bayonets gleaming. For the Americans, the sight was overwhelming. They were farmers and tradesmen, facing the finest infantry on the planet. But they had a strategy born of desperation. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. The first wave of British regulars ascended the slope. The Americans held their breath, their knuckles white against their muskets. Then, at the critical moment, the hillside erupted. A volley of colonial fire tore through the advancing red lines. The effect was devastating. The British, caught in the open, were mowed down by a concentrated wall of lead. A second wave was sent forward. Again, the Americans held. Again, The volley was devastating. The slopes of the hill began to turn red. The British officers, seeing their men falter, pressed the attack with renewed ferocity, forcing the rebels to expend their precious, dwindling ammunition. When the third charge was ordered, the American lines finally buckled. Out of gunpowder and exhausted by the sheer intensity of the slaughter, the militia retreated from the redoubt. The British had taken the hill. They had won the ground. But as the smoke cleared, a grim realization settled over the British ranks. They had taken the heights, but at a cost that was staggering. The casualties were nearly 3 times higher than those of the Americans. It was a Pyrrhic victory, a win that felt increasingly like a defeat. Bunker Hill proved that the Americans could fight, and more importantly, that they could bleed the British Empire. The myth of British invincibility had been shattered. The war was no longer just about territory. It was about the terrifying realization that this struggle would be long, it would be bloody, and it would be won only by the side that could endure the most. May 10, 1775, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The echoes of the musketry at Bunker Hill had reached the halls of the Pennsylvania State House, and the atmosphere inside was heavy with a new, terrifying clarity. The time for mere protest had passed. The time for governance had arrived. As delegates from the 13 colonies drifted into Philadelphia, they were no longer just representatives of aggrieved provinces. They were the architects of a burgeoning, unauthorized nation. The Second Continental Congress convened in a state of profound uncertainty. Unlike the First Congress, which had sought reconciliation with the Crown, this gathering faced a much more visceral reality. The blood was already being spilled. The delegates were divided by deep-seated fears. Some, mostly from the middle colonies, clung to the hope that if they showed sufficient loyalty and addressed specific grievances, King George III might yet listen. Others, particularly from New England, believed the bridge to London had been burned forever. But amidst this ideological tug-of-war, a practical necessity emerged that demanded immediate action. The colonies were at war, whether they had officially declared it or not. An army existed in the field around Boston, but it was a chaotic assembly of local militias, lacking a central command, standardized equipment, or a unified purpose. Without a formal military structure, the rebellion risked dissolving into a series of disconnected, localized skirmishes that the British could easily crush one by one. The Congress realized that to survive, they had to act like a government. They had to do what the British would call treason. They had to raise an army. In a move that would change the course of history, the delegates turned to a man who embodied the very essence of the American character. They looked to George Washington. A Virginian, Washington was a man of immense prestige, a veteran of the French and Indian War, and a figure who could bridge the geographic divide between the North and the South. By appointing him commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, the Congress was making a calculated political gamble. They weren't just choosing a general. They were attempting to weave the disparate colonies into a single, cohesive entity. The task ahead was Herculean. The Congress found itself tasked with the impossible, managing a war without a treasury, funding an army without a tax system, and commanding men who often felt more loyalty to their home provinces than to a central body. They began the grueling work of requisitioning supplies, printing paper money, and attempting to coordinate logistics across vast, rugged distances. As the delegates debated, they were simultaneously laying the groundwork for the legal existence of the United States. They were creating committees to manage intelligence, to handle foreign diplomacy, and to oversee the procurement of arms. They were, in essence, building a state from the ground up in the middle of a hurricane. The Second Continental Congress was the crucible of the Revolution. It was here, amidst the heated arguments and the crushing weight of responsibility, that the concept of America began to move from a collection of shared grievances to a functioning, living reality. They were no longer just subjects fighting against a law. They were a people fighting for a country. January 1776, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. While the delegates in the halls of the State House labored over logistics, troop movements, and the daunting task of financing a war, a different kind of revolution was brewing, one that did not require muskets or cannons but words. For months, the American cause had been trapped in a psychological limbo. The fighting at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill had proven that the British were willing to use force, but many in the colonies were still hesitant to commit to the unthinkable, total independence. To most, the conflict was seen as a dispute over rights, a struggle to be restored to the good old days of British constitutional protection. They were fighting to reform the empire, not to destroy it. The idea of a complete break from the British crown was still viewed by many as radical, even treasonous, and potentially suicidal. That hesitation was shattered by a single, unassuming pamphlet. Enter Thomas Paine. A man of modest means and even more modest origins, Paine was an immigrant from England who had arrived in the colonies only a few years prior. He was not a polished statesman, nor was he a member of the landed gentry. He was a man who understood the language of the common person, the blacksmith, the farmer, the sailor, and the merchant. In January 1776, he published Common Sense. It was a masterstroke of political communication. While the Continental Congress spoke in the dense, legalistic prose of Enlightenment philosophy, Paine spoke in the visceral, blunt language of the street. He did not mince words. He did not appeal to complex theories of social contracts. He appealed to the gut. Paine's central argument was devastatingly simple. Why should a tiny island, separated by 3,000 miles of ocean, rule over a vast, sprawling continent? He attacked the very institution of monarchy, calling King George III a royal brute, and ridiculing the idea that one man should have a divine right to rule over millions. He argued that monarchy was not only unnatural but inherently corrupt, a system that prioritized the whims of a tyrant over the common good of the people. But more importantly, Paine gave the colonists a vision of what lay beyond the conflict. He wasn't just arguing against Britain, he was arguing for America. He framed independence not as a desperate rebellion, but as an inevitable necessity. He argued that the colonies were not merely a collection of disgruntled provinces, but a new entity entirely, a place where liberty could flourish unburdened by the baggage of European dynastic wars and royal corruption. The impact was instantaneous and electric. Common Sense became an overnight sensation, an intellectual wildfire that spread from the coffee houses of Philadelphia to the taverns of rural New England. It was read aloud in village squares and debated in every corner of the 13 colonies. For the first time, the argument for independence moved out of the closed rooms of the elite and into the hands of the masses. Paine had done what the Congress had struggled to do. He had bridged the gap between political theory and public will. He had transformed the conflict from a legal dispute over taxes into a moral crusade for self-determination. The middle ground of reconciliation was evaporating. Through the power of the printed word, Thomas Paine had made the idea of an independent United States not just possible, but inevitable. June 1776, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The intellectual wildfire ignited by Thomas Paine had done its work. The psychological barrier had been breached. The question was no longer if the colonies should be independent, but how they would justify such an act to a world that still viewed monarchy as the natural order of the universe. Inside the sweltering, cramped quarters of the Pennsylvania State House, the Second Continental Congress faced a monumental task. They were no longer just managing a war. They were attempting to birth a nation. To do this, they needed more than a list of grievances. They needed a manifesto, a document that would transform a rebellion into a legitimate sovereign state. On June 11th, a committee of 5 was appointed to draft this declaration. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. While the committee held the responsibility, the heavy lifting of the prose fell to the youngest member, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was a man of profound intellect, steeped in the Enlightenment philosophies of John Locke and Montesquieu. He understood that this document could not merely be a rant against King George. It had to be a legal and moral argument that resonated with the ages. He sought to ground the American cause in self-evident truths, principles that did not rely on the whims of kings or the traditions of Europe, but on the inherent rights of humanity itself. The draft was a masterpiece of structured logic. It began with a grand philosophical preamble, asserting that all men are created equal and are endowed with unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. From there, Jefferson pivoted to the core of the political argument, that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right, indeed the duty, of the people to abolish it. Then came the indictment. Jefferson transitioned from the abstract to the concrete, listing a long, stinging catalog of grievances against King George III. He accused the crown of imposing taxes without consent, obstructing justice, and waging war against the colonies themselves. This was the evidence. This was the proof that the social contract had been broken. As the draft moved through the halls of Congress, it underwent a grueling process of editing. The delegates, wary of offending potential allies and mindful of the gravity of treason, debated every word. They struck out passages regarding the slave trade to maintain colonial unity, a compromise that would haunt the nation's future. Yet at this moment, the priority was survival through solidarity. Finally, on July 2nd, the Congress voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, the formal text was approved. When the Declaration was read aloud, it was not merely a political announcement. It was a seismic shift in the human story. It was a declaration of war, certainly, but it was also a declaration of existence. By putting pen to paper, the colonists had crossed the Rubicon. They had ceased to be British subjects seeking redress. They had become Americans, claiming their place among the nations of the earth. The pursuit of liberty had officially become a formal, organized, and irreversible crusade. April 1775, Boston, Massachusetts. While the philosophers in Philadelphia were debating the abstract rights of man, the reality of war was already choking the narrow, cobblestone streets of Boston. The siege of Boston was not a single, cinematic battle, but a grueling, months-long strangulation, a tense, psychological standoff that served as the crucible for the nascent American army. Following the bloody skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, the British military presence in Boston had been effectively trapped. The British regulars, professional and disciplined, held the fortified town and the vital harbor. Surrounding them, however, was a growing, disorganized, and increasingly determined ring of colonial militia. From the heights of Dorchester to the rural outskirts of Roxbury, the Minutemen had dug in. They had turned the geography of Massachusetts into a cage. For the British, Boston had become a gilded prison. They controlled the streets, but they did not control the countryside. They could command the sea, but they could not break the encirclement of colonial sharpshooters and makeshift artillery. For the colonists, the siege was a test of will. They were a collection of farmers, merchants, and blacksmiths, attempting to maintain a blockade against the most powerful empire on earth. As the spring of 1775 bled into the summer, the atmosphere was one of suffocating tension. The British sat behind their ramparts, watching the hills, waiting for a decisive blow that never came. The colonists, meanwhile, struggled with the logistical nightmare of a revolution. How do you feed, clothe, and arm an army that exists primarily on passion and improvised supplies? The siege was characterized by a strange, lethal stillness. There were sudden, violent outbursts of gunfire, skirmishes over a lost cow or a misplaced patrol, but for the most part it was a war of nerves. It was a period of intense preparation. Under the shadow of the siege, the Second Continental Congress realized that passion would not win a war against professional infantry. They needed a commander. They needed structure. And most importantly, they needed heavy metal. The stalemate reached its breaking point in late 1775, when news arrived that Henry Knox, a former bookseller with an uncanny knack for logistics, had performed a feat of near-impossible engineering. He had hauled tons of heavy artillery from the fort at Ticonderoga, hundreds of miles through frozen wilderness, to bring to the gates of Boston. This changed everything. The siege was no longer a passive blockade. It was about to become a lethal confrontation. The arrival of these cannons meant that the colonial forces could finally strike back at the British fortifications from a distance. In March 1776, the tension finally snapped. Under the direction of George Washington, who had arrived to take command of the Continental Army, the Americans moved their new cannons to the heights of Dorchester. As the sun rose, the British looked up to see the unmistakable silhouettes of heavy artillery pointed directly at their hearts. The roar of the American guns signaled the end of the stalemate. Realizing that the town was no longer tenable, General William Howe ordered a tactical withdrawal. On March 17th, the British fleet began to pull away from the harbor, leaving Boston in American hands. The siege was broken. The colonists had achieved their first major strategic victory, proving that they could not only resist the crown, but they could actually force it to retreat. November 1776, New York City. The victory at Boston had provided a fleeting sense of hope, but as the summer faded into autumn, that optimism was met with a crushing, professional reality. The British, having redirected their full might toward the center of the rebellion, arrived in New York with a force the likes of which the colonies had never seen. This was not a local skirmish. This was a tidal wave of imperial power. General George Washington, tasked with defending the vital port of New York, found himself outmatched in every conceivable metric. The British possessed naval supremacy that turned the surrounding waters into a highway for reinforcements, and their infantry were seasoned veterans of global warfare. When the British struck at the Battle of Long Island in August, the American lines did not just bend, they shattered. What followed was a desperate, harrowing fight. The Continental Army, once a symbol of rising defiance, was transformed into a fleeing mass of exhausted men. The retreat was not a strategic maneuver. It was a race for survival. Washington was forced to pull his troops back through the winding corridors of Manhattan, then across the treacherous terrain of Staten Island, and finally into the rugged hills of New Jersey. By the time the Americans reached the Jersey Highlands, the spirit of the revolution was on life support. The retreat had been a catastrophe of logistics and morale. Men were starving, many were barefoot, and their clothing was little more than tattered rags. The relentless pursuit by British light infantry and Hessian mercenaries meant there was no rest, only the constant, gnawing fear of being overtaken and captured. As the autumn rains turned the roads into quagmires of freezing mud, a profound sense of despair settled over the camp. The patriot cause seemed to be evaporating. In the taverns and town squares of the colonies, the conversation had shifted from the glory of independence to the inevitability of defeat. Desertion rates skyrocketed. Men, seeing no path to victory, simply walked away into the dark woods. The Continental Army had become a ghost of its former self. Washington himself was haunted by the realization that he was presiding over the death of a revolution. If he lost this army, the war was over. There would be no more declarations, no more continental congresses, only the grim reality of a conquered people. The situation reached its nadir in late November. The American forces were pushed back into a narrow strip of land along the Delaware River. They were trapped between the advancing British columns and the icy, unforgiving waters of the river. The weather turned lethal. A brutal, early winter set in, bringing freezing rain and snow that bit through the soldiers' meager layers. Disease and exposure became as deadly as British bayonets. By mid-December, the Continental Army was a hollow shell. They were scattered, demoralized, and facing the end of their existence. The dream of a new nation was being buried under a layer of frost. The history books often speak of the miracles that followed, but in those dark days of 1776, there were no miracles in sight, only the cold, the hunger, and the terrifying silence of a cause that was about to vanish. December 25, 1776, the banks of the Delaware River. The atmosphere was not one of celebration, but of grim, desperate necessity. While much of the English-speaking world prepared for the warmth of Christmas, the men of the Continental Army were huddled in the shadows of the Jersey shoreline, staring across a river that looked less like water and more like a churning expanse of liquid ice. The wind howled with a predatory ferocity, whipping sleet and snow into a blinding white veil. For George Washington, the mathematics of the situation were devastating. His army was down to roughly 2,400 effectives. Many were too sick to stand, and even fewer were fit to fight. Across the river sat the Hessian garrison at Trenton, elite, professional German mercenaries, disciplined and well-supplied. If Washington did nothing, the revolution would die in the frost. If he failed this gamble, he would not just lose a battle, he would lose the very idea of America. The plan was as audacious as it was suicidal. A night crossing of the Delaware, followed by a surprise strike against the Hessians. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the operation began. This was not a grand naval maneuver, but a chaotic, freezing struggle against the elements. The Americans utilized Durham boats, heavy, flat-bottomed vessels designed for hauling freight, not transporting an army. The river was choked with massive chunks of ice that collided with the hulls like battering rams. The current was treacherous, pulling at the oars and threatening to sweep the men into the black, freezing depths. The soldiers, already weakened by weeks of retreat, fought a war against the cold before they ever drew a sword. Fingers went numb, making it nearly impossible to grip oars or handle muskets. Men slipped on the icy banks, and the silence of the night was broken only by the rhythmic, labored breathing of exhausted men and the terrifying crack of shifting ice. Every splash of an oar felt like a signal to the British. Every gust of wind sounded like an alarm. Yet through the blinding sleet and the bone-deep chill, the men moved. They moved because they had nothing left to lose. By the early hours of Christmas morning, the crossing was complete. The American forces began their trek toward Trenton, marching through a landscape that felt alien and hostile. The mud had frozen into jagged ruts, and the snow was waist-deep in places. There was no glory in this march, only the rhythmic, agonizing trudge of men who were walking toward a possibility of life or the certainty of death. As the gray light of dawn began to break through the storm clouds, the Continental Army emerged from the whiteout. They were a ragged, bedraggled sight, men in tattered hunting shirts and frozen breeches, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a dying cause. But as they crested the final rise and saw the town of Trenton ahead, the despair began to shift into something else, a feral, concentrated resolve. The surprise was total. The Hessians, expecting a quiet Christmas, were caught in the midst of their morning routines. What followed was a whirlwind of musket fire and bayonet charges in the slush and snow. It was a chaotic, close-quarters struggle, but the momentum belonged to the Americans. When the smoke cleared, the impossible had happened. The Americans had captured nearly 1,000 prisoners, seized vital supplies, and most importantly, reclaimed their will to fight. The dark days had been broken by a single, daring stroke of defiance. The revolution was no longer a dying dream. It had been reborn in the ice of the Delaware. August 1776, Manhattan Island. If the crossing of the Delaware was the Revolution's rebirth, then the summer of 1776 was its near extinction. To understand the scale of the American disaster, one must look back to the weeks preceding the triumphs in New Jersey. While the spirit of the colonies had been ignited by the Declaration of Independence, the reality of the war was about to be crushed under the weight of the world's greatest superpower. The British Empire did not come to America with a mere skirmish force. They came with an armada. As the summer heat settled over the colonies, a massive British fleet began to descend upon New York Harbor, transforming the skyline into a forest of masts and rigging. This was not just a military movement. It was a demonstration of overwhelming global dominance. For the Continental Army, New York was the strategic prize, the gateway to the colonies. If the British could seize it, they could sever the rebellious heart of the North from the rest of the continent. George Washington, tasked with defending this vital hub, found himself in a nightmare of tactical disadvantage. He was commanding a patchwork army of volunteers, militia, and a few disciplined regulars, pitted against a professional war machine led by General William Howe. The British possessed something the Americans could not dream of: absolute command of the sea. The loss of New York was not a single, sudden blow, but a series of agonizing tactical failures. The Battle of Long Island in August was the first great shock. Washington's forces were outmaneuvered, caught in a pincer movement that sent them fleeing through the woods and marshes in a state of near panic. The Americans were forced into a desperate, harrowing retreat, clinging to the edges of Manhattan, waiting for a salvation that seemed increasingly unlikely. The geography of New York became a trap. The British utilized their naval superiority to land troops behind American lines, cutting off paths of retreat and turning every street and hedgerow into a potential killing zone. The Continental Army was pushed relentlessly from the heights of Brooklyn, through the narrow confines of Manhattan, and eventually toward the northern tip of the island. As the summer turned to autumn, the situation became catastrophic. The Americans were backed against the East River, with the British fleet looming offshore like a predator waiting for the final kill. The sheer scale of the British logistics, the endless supply of gunpowder, the disciplined volleys of the redcoats, and the terrifying efficiency of their naval artillery made the American cause look like a fool's errand. The retreat from New York was a long, humiliating march of survival. Washington was forced to abandon the city, leaving behind much-needed supplies and precious equipment. The loss of New York was a strategic catastrophe that stripped the Americans of their most important port and forced the Revolution into a period of wandering, desperate survival. It was a defeat that should have ended the war then and there. Yet it was this very humiliation, this crushing realization of how far they stood from true power, that would eventually forge the steel required for the miracles that followed. Before the glory of Trenton, there was the bitter, cold reality of defeat in the streets of New York. Summer 1777, the Hudson River Valley. While George Washington was fighting a desperate, defensive war in the South, a different, perhaps even more decisive shadow was falling across the northern colonies. The British High Command had devised a masterstroke, a plan not just to defeat the Continental Army, but to sever the rebellion in two. The strategy was ambitious and elegant in its simplicity. Under the command of General John Burgoyne, a massive force of British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, and Native American allies would descend from the Canadian wilderness. Their objective: to march south from Quebec, seize control of the Hudson River, and link up with British forces in New York City. If successful, the colonies would be split into isolated pockets, unable to share men, money, or hope. The revolution would be strangled in its cradle. But the wilderness of upstate New York was not the orderly battlefield Burgoyne had envisioned. It was a dense, unforgiving labyrinth of thick forests and treacherous swamps. As the British column pushed southward, they found themselves not marching through an open corridor, but through a gauntlet of colonial resistance. The Americans, led by the doggedly determined General Horatio Gates and the tactical brilliance of Benedict Arnold, understood the geography of this struggle. They knew they could not meet the British in a grand, open-field engagement. Instead, they turned the very terrain against them. They utilized Indian-style warfare, ambushes, snipers, and hit-and-run tactics that bled the British lines and shattered their confidence. The campaign began to unravel with terrifying speed. At the Battle of Freeman's Farm, the British held the field, but at a cost so staggering that they were effectively stalled. They were no longer an advancing juggernaut. They were a trapped beast, starving and surrounded. As the British struggled to maintain their supply lines, the American militia swelled in number, fueled by a growing realization that the invincible redcoats could be bled. The tension reached a breaking point in the autumn of 1777. The British, now desperate and undersupplied, found themselves pinned against the very river they sought to control. At the Battle of Bemis Heights, the momentum shifted irrevocably. Benedict Arnold, disregarding orders but driven by a ferocious instinct for victory, led a charge that broke the British lines, turning a tactical stalemate into a chaotic rout. By mid-October, the unthinkable had happened. General Burgoyne, surrounded by a growing army of thousands of Continental soldiers and local militiamen, realized there was no escape. On October 17, 1777, the British Army surrendered. The surrender at Saratoga was more than just a military victory. It was a seismic shift in the global balance of power. News of the triumph rippled across the Atlantic, reaching the courts of Europe. It provided the ultimate proof that the Americans were not merely a disorganized rabble, but a legitimate force capable of defeating a superpower. For King Louis XVI of France, Saratoga was the signal he had been waiting for. The American Revolution was no longer a colonial insurrection. It was now a global conflict. The gates of diplomacy had swung open, and with the arrival of French gold troops and, most importantly, their navy, the war for independence had entered a new, decisive chapter. The survival of the revolution was no longer in doubt. The struggle for its victory had truly begun. February 1778, Paris, France. The victory at Saratoga had acted as a lightning bolt, striking the heart of Europe and illuminating a path that had previously been shrouded in diplomatic secrecy. For years, the American cause had been fighting a lonely, desperate war of attrition. They had been a collection of 13 colonies shouting into a void, hoping for a sympathetic ear in the courts of the Old World. But now, the void had answered. The formal signing of the Treaty of Alliance changed everything. This was not merely a gesture of friendship or a sympathetic nod from a distant monarch. It was a profound, calculated geopolitical gamble. By committing to the American cause, King Louis XVI was doing more than helping a group of rebels. He was engaging in a grand strategy to avenge France's humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War. The goal was simple: to weaken the British Empire, dismantle its hegemony, and restore the balance of power in Europe. However, the alliance was not born of pure idealism. The French government, wary of the radical democratic philosophies emanating from the colonies, sought to ensure that the treaty was a pragmatic military pact rather than a moral crusade. They wanted to ensure that if the Americans won, they would remain a stable, manageable entity that would not threaten French interests in the Caribbean or the Americas. Despite these political subtleties, the practical impact on the ground in America was immediate and transformative. The arrival of French aid arrived not as a single wave, but as a vital, life-sustaining flood. First came the specie, the hard gold and silver that the Continental Congress so desperately needed to pay its starving soldiers and purchase much-needed supplies. For a revolution that had been teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, French finance was the oxygen that kept the embers of rebellion glowing. Then came the materiel. Massive shipments of muskets, gunpowder, bayonets, and uniforms began to arrive in American ports. The Continental Army, which had often been forced to fight with hunting rifles and rags, began to transform into a more professional, standardized fighting force. But perhaps the most critical component of this alliance was the human element. The arrival of the French Expeditionary Force, led by the Comte de Rochambeau, brought with it a level of professional military expertise that the Americans desperately lacked. These were soldiers trained in the sophisticated siege warfare and grand maneuvers of the European continent. They brought discipline, heavy artillery, and a strategic depth that would eventually prove indispensable. Yet the most profound shift was not found in the muskets or the gold, but in the water. The French Navy, one of the most formidable maritime powers in the world, began to move into position. For the first time, the British Royal Navy, the undisputed master of the seas, would have to contend with a peer competitor. The war was no longer confined to the forests of New York or the hills of Massachusetts. It had spilled into the Atlantic, stretching the British military thin across a global chessboard. The French alliance had fundamentally rewritten the rules of engagement. The Americans were no longer insurgents fighting a localized rebellion. They were now partners in a global war of empires. The stage was set for a confrontation that would move from the rugged American wilderness to the very shores of the South, where the combined might of two nations would ultimately collide in a final, decisive struggle for independence. December 1777, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. While the diplomats in Paris were weaving a new tapestry of global geopolitics, the men actually fighting the war were trapped in a nightmare of frozen mud and starvation. To understand the triumph of the American Revolution, one must first understand the agony of Valley Forge. This was not a battlefield of grand maneuvers or heroic charges. It was a battle against the very elements of nature, fought in a desolate landscape of rolling hills and dense woods. As the autumn rains turned to a punishing winter freeze, George Washington made the agonizing decision to encamp his army here, just miles from the British occupation of Philadelphia. It was a strategic move intended to guard the approaches to the capital, but for the Continental Army, it became a crucible of suffering. The scene was one of unimaginable deprivation. The Continental Congress, crippled by debt and administrative chaos, had failed in its most basic duty, to feed and clothe its defenders. As the snow fell, the army began to disintegrate, not from British bullets but from hunger and disease. Thousands of men, many of whom had marched hundreds of miles from the periphery of the colonies, arrived with nothing but the rags on their backs. The physical toll was devastating. Soldiers huddled in makeshift log huts, shivering in thin, tattered clothing that offered no protection against the biting Pennsylvania frost. Without adequate footwear, many men marched through the snow barefoot, their feet turning black with frostbite. Disease swept through the encampment like a silent killer. Smallpox, typhus, and dysentery tore through the ranks, claiming more lives than any skirmish ever could. At its lowest point, the army was a ghost of itself, a collection of hollow-eyed skeletal men, drifting on the edge of total collapse. Yet it was within this valley of shadows that the character of the American Revolution was forged. If the war had ended in the winter of 1777, it would have ended in a graveyard. But George Washington, possessing a will of iron, refused to let the flame of rebellion be extinguished by the cold. He understood that an army that cannot endure hardship cannot win a war. In the midst of this misery, a transformation began to take root. It arrived in the form of a Prussian officer, Baron Friedrich von Steuben. A man of immense energy and uncompromising discipline, von Steuben saw not a mob of starving peasants, but the raw material of a professional military. He did not care for their hunger or their rags. He cared for their drill, their bayonet work, and their hygiene. Under the biting wind, von Steuben implemented a rigorous training regimen. He taught the men how to march in formation, how to load and fire their muskets with precision, and how to maintain the camps that were killing them. He turned the chaos of survival into the discipline of war. Valley Forge was the ultimate test of the American spirit. It was the moment when the rebel was stripped away, and the soldier was born. The men who emerged from those frozen hills in the spring of 1778 were no longer a disorganized militia. They were a professional Continental Army, hardened by suffering and unified by a shared ordeal. They had stared into the abyss of defeat and through sheer endurance had refused to blink. early 1778, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The thaw had come to Valley Forge, and with it, a new Continental Army emerged, disciplined, drilled, and ready for a war that was about to fundamentally change its geography. But as Washington's men looked south, they saw a landscape that told a different story. For years, the war had been a grueling stalemate in the north, a series of skirmishes and sieges in the dense forests of New England and the mid-Atlantic. The British held the cities, but they could not hold the countryside. To break this deadlock, the British High Command realized they needed a new approach. They needed a decisive blow, and they believed they would find it in the South. This was the birth of the Southern Strategy. British planners, fueled by a growing confidence in their naval supremacy and a belief that the American rebellion was losing its momentum, envisioned a grand sweep from the Carolinas up through Virginia. Their logic was deceptively simple. The Southern colonies were more populated, more prosperous, and most importantly, more loyal to the Crown. The British believed that if they could establish a firm foothold in the South, they could tap into a massive, dormant reservoir of loyalist support. They envisioned a wave of Tories rising up to join them, providing the manpower and supplies necessary to crush the rebellion once and for all. The strategy was not merely about territory, it was about psychological warfare. The British aimed to isolate the rebellious northern colonies by carving out a secure, pro-British bastion in the south. They believed the southern backcountry was a tinderbox of royalist sentiment just waiting for a spark. But the British had underestimated the complexity of the southern landscape and the volatility of its people. The South was not a monolith of loyalty. It was a fractured society, torn apart by deep-seated local grievances, religious differences, and a simmering tension between the coastal elites and the rugged frontiersmen. As the British began their slow, methodical descent, they did not find a welcoming populace. Instead, they found a landscape of shifting allegiances and hidden dangers. While the British moved with the heavy, deliberate pace of a professional empire, they were entering a theater of war that would soon demand a different kind of combat. The arrival of British forces in the South signaled the end of the war as a localized colonial uprising and the beginning of a brutal scorched-earth struggle. It was a gamble of immense proportions. If the British could mobilize the Loyalists, the revolution would be strangled in its cradle. But if they failed, they would find themselves trapped in a vast, unforgiving wilderness, fighting an enemy that had learned to strike from the shadows. The stage was set. The British were moving, the Loyalists were watching, and the South was about to become the most violent and unpredictable battlefield of the entire American Revolution. The grand design of the Southern strategy was in motion, but as the first British boots hit the soil of the Carolinas, the true cost of this gamble was yet to be realized. March 1780, Charleston, South Carolina. If the British Southern strategy was a grand architectural design, then Charleston was to be its cornerstone. As the most prosperous port in the South, a jewel of the Atlantic trade, and a vital hub of colonial commerce, its capture would provide the British with more than just a harbor. It would provide legitimacy. To the British High Command, Charleston was the key that would unlock the entire Southern theater. The siege began not with a roar, but with a tightening noose. Under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton, a massive British force, supported by an overwhelming naval blockade, began to converge on the city. On the water, the Royal Navy's sails choked the harbor, cutting off the lifeline of supplies and reinforcements from the north. On land, the British Army moved with the crushing weight of a professional juggernaut, encircling the city and its defensive lines. Inside the walls, the atmosphere was one of mounting desperation. The American forces, commanded by Major General Benjamin Lincoln, were in a precarious position. They were tasked with defending a sprawling, urban landscape against an enemy that possessed nearly every military advantage: superior numbers, heavy artillery, and the absolute control of the seas. The Continental troops, though better trained than they had been at the start of the war, were spread thin, attempting to hold a perimeter that was far too large for their numbers. As the weeks dragged on, the siege turned into a grueling war of attrition. British heavy guns began to pound the American fortifications, turning the outskirts of Charleston into a landscape of splintered wood and broken earth. The bombardment was relentless. For the citizens trapped within the city, the sound of cannon fire became the heartbeat of a terrifying new reality. Food grew scarce, and the psychological toll of being trapped between a professional army and an impassable ocean began to weigh heavily on the defenders. General Lincoln faced an impossible dilemma. Every day he held the city, he risked the total destruction of his force. Every day he retreated, he conceded the South to the Crown. The British were not merely looking for a skirmish. They were looking for a capitulation. They were waiting for the moment when the defenders' will to resist finally snapped. That moment arrived in May. Recognizing that further resistance would lead to a massacre of both his soldiers and the civilian population, General Lincoln was forced to make the most devastating decision of his career. On May 12, 1780, the white flag was raised. The surrender of Charleston was not just a tactical loss, it was a catastrophe. It was the largest surrender of American forces during the entire Revolutionary War. Thousands of Continental soldiers were taken prisoner, effectively wiping out the organized American military presence in the Deep South in a single stroke. The British had achieved their cornerstone. They held the port, they held the wealth, and they held the momentum. For a moment, it appeared the Southern strategy had worked perfectly. The British had struck the decisive blow they had envisioned, and the American cause in the South seemed to be on the verge of extinction. But as the British celebrated their triumph in the streets of Charleston, they were unaware that they had not extinguished the fire of rebellion. They had simply forced it underground. The fall of the city would not be the end of the war. It would be the catalyst for a new, more primal kind of conflict. May 1780, the South Carolina Low Country. With the fall of Charleston, the British High Command believed they had effectively won the South. The organized, professional Continental Army had been neutralized, its officers captured, and its men marched into prisoner camps. To the British, the rebellion in the Carolinas was a dying ember, smothered by the weight of their superior infantry and naval might. But they had made a fundamental error in their calculation. They had defeated an army, but they had failed to subdue a people. In the vacuum left by the collapse of formal military structures, a new, more shadow-like form of warfare began to emerge. This was not the war of bright uniforms, synchronized volleys, and gentlemanly surrender. This was something much older, much more visceral, and far more unpredictable. This was guerrilla warfare. As the British moved inland to consolidate their control, they found themselves not in a peaceful, conquered territory, but in a landscape of constant, invisible threat. The vast, impenetrable swamps, the dense forests, and the labyrinthine marshes of the Carolinas became the ultimate sanctuary for the displaced and the defiant. Here, the war shifted from the battlefield to the periphery. Leading this irregular resistance were men who had nothing left to lose. They were frontiersmen, local militia, and former soldiers who had refused to lay down their arms. They did not seek to hold territory or engage in grand maneuvers. Instead, they sought to bleed the British machine through 1,000 small cuts. They utilized hit-and-run tactics, striking a supply convoy, burning a forage wagon, or ambushing a small patrol, only to vanish back into the cypress knees and Spanish moss before the British could even fix their bayonets. Among these partisan leaders, few names would strike more fear into the hearts of British officers than Francis Marion. Known to his men as the Swamp Fox, Marion became the personification of this new American reality. He understood that he could never win a head-on confrontation against the British regulars. Instead, he mastered the art of the ambush. He used the terrain as a weapon, drawing the enemy into the treacherous wetlands where their heavy equipment and disciplined formations became liabilities. The British response was a mixture of frustration and escalating brutality. Unable to catch the elusive partisans in the woods, they turned their anger toward the civilian population. They implemented harsh measures, demanding loyalty and punishing any settlement suspected of harboring rebels. This, however, proved to be a strategic blunder of catastrophic proportions. Each act of British reprisal served only to radicalize the local populace, driving more men into the woods and more families into the service of the partisans. The war had transformed. It was no longer a conflict between two organized states. It had become a bitter, intimate civil war. It was a war of intelligence, of nocturnal raids, and of psychological attrition. The British held the cities and the ports, but they were losing control of the countryside. The Southern strategy was beginning to buckle under the weight of an enemy they could see, but could never quite catch. The fire of rebellion had indeed been forced underground, and in the darkness of the Carolina swamps, it was burning hotter than ever before. 1780, the Caribbean Sea. While the blood and grit of the Southern campaign soaked into the soil of the Carolinas, a much larger, more complex machine was grinding into motion across the Atlantic. To understand why the American Revolution did not remain a localized colonial uprising, one must look away from the swamps of the South and toward the shimmering, sugar-coated waters of the West Indies. The conflict had ceased to be a civil war between king and subject. It had become a global struggle for empire, a chess match played across 3 oceans. For the British, the American colonies were only one piece of a vast, imperial puzzle. The Caribbean islands, Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands, were the crown jewels of the British Empire, generating immense wealth through the sugar trade. As the rebellion intensified, the British military was forced into a strategic nightmare. They had to defend their most profitable colonies from French and Spanish encroachment while simultaneously trying to suppress the American insurgency. The Southern strategy was no longer just about reclaiming Georgia or South Carolina. It was about managing a global deficit of manpower and resources. By late 1780, the geopolitical landscape had shifted violently. The French, having formally entered the war, were not merely sending supplies. They were deploying their navy and their professional infantry to strike at the very heart of British interests. In the Caribbean, the theater of war was defined by naval blockades, massive fleet engagements, and the constant threat of island invasions. The British Royal Navy, long considered the undisputed master of the seas, found itself stretched to the breaking point. forced to choose between protecting the American coastline and defending the lucrative Caribbean plantations. But the war was not confined to the tropics. In the waters of the English Channel and the ports of Europe, the conflict took on a sophisticated, diplomatic, and high-stakes character. The entry of the Dutch Republic into the war on the side of the Americans added another layer of complexity, challenging British control over vital shipping lanes and financial hubs. In the halls of European courts, the war was fought with pens and treaties as much as with cannons. France and Spain were not merely supporting the Americans out of a love for liberty. They were calculating how to dismantle the British hegemony that had dominated the seas for a century. Every American victory, every British setback, was measured by how it shifted the balance of power in Europe. The American Revolution had become a catalyst for a world war, drawing in the greatest powers of the age. This global expansion meant that the British High Command could no longer focus exclusively on crushing Washington or Cornwallis. They were fighting a war of attrition on a planetary scale. For every regiment sent to hunt the swamp fox in the Carolina marshes, another was needed to defend a Caribbean outpost or to intercept a French fleet in the Atlantic. The British were winning tactical battles in the American South, but they were losing the strategic war of resources. The empire was being pulled in too many directions, its strength diluted by the sheer scale of the conflict. The revolution had escaped its colonial cradle, and in doing so, it had forced the most powerful empire on earth to fight a war that was too big to win. September 1780, Savannah, Georgia. As the British Empire struggled to balance its global commitments, it turned its sights toward the Deep South, seeking a strategic anchor that could solidify its control over the southern colonies. That anchor was to be Savannah. If the British could secure this vital port, they would possess a formidable base of operations, a gateway to the Atlantic, and a psychological stronghold from which to launch their crushing campaign into the Carolinas. The arrival of the British fleet in the waters off Georgia signaled the beginning of a grim chapter in the war. This was not a skirmish of light infantry or a series of sudden raids in the woods. This was a formal, heavy-handed siege of a fortified city. Led by the experienced Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell, a formidable British force descended upon the city, bringing with them the overwhelming weight of professional European warfare. For the American defenders, the situation was dire. The Continental forces in the region were fractured, under strength, and reeling from the recent loss of Charleston. Savannah was defended by a patchwork of militia and a dwindling number of Continental regulars, many of whom were more accustomed to the skirmishes of the back country than the disciplined, thunderous artillery barrages of a formal siege. The Americans had fortified the outskirts, digging in behind earthworks and utilizing the natural geography of the Savannah River to create a defensive perimeter. But the British were not merely coming to fight, they were coming to dominate. As the siege lines tightened, the reality of urban warfare began to settle over the city. The British utilized their naval superiority to blockade the coast, cutting off the city's lifeline to the sea, and ensuring that no reinforcements or supplies could reach the besieged Americans. The air grew thick with the smell of salt, gunpowder, and the looming shadow of starvation. The siege was characterized by a brutal, methodical progression. British engineers worked under the cover of darkness to approach the American lines, digging trenches and preparing batteries that would slowly, inch by inch, bring the American fortifications under the devastating fire of heavy cannon. The Americans, caught between the rising walls of British earthworks and the encroaching sea, found themselves fighting a war of attrition they were ill-equipped to win. In the heat of the Georgia autumn, the fighting was intense and localized. Every yard of ground gained by the British was paid for in blood. The American militia, though fighting with a desperate fervor to protect their homes, found themselves outmatched by the sheer discipline and technical proficiency of the British regulars. The siege was a test of endurance, a psychological grinding down of the defenders' will to resist. By the time the final assault was organized, the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The American defenses were crumbling under the relentless bombardment. On September 29th, the realization set in: Savannah could not hold. The surrender of the city was not just a tactical defeat, it was a catastrophic blow to the American cause in the South. With Savannah firmly in British hands, the Southern strategy gained its most significant foothold. The British had achieved their objective, establishing a bastion of loyalist power and a launching pad for further conquest. The stage was set for the most violent and unpredictable phase of the war. Late 1780, the Southern colonies. With the fall of Savannah, the British Empire felt as though it finally held the winning hand. The Southern strategy was no longer a theoretical plan discussed in the halls of London. It was a living, breathing machine of conquest. To the British High Command, the tide had turned. They were no longer merely fighting a rebellion. They were reclaiming a lost province. The momentum was driven by a belief that the American South was a sleeping giant of loyalty. British intelligence suggested that if they could only establish secure coastal strongholds, the thousands of loyalists, colonists who remained faithful to the crown, would rise up in a massive, coordinated wave to sweep the Continental Army from the landscape. This wasn't just about territory, it was about legitimacy. The British sought to prove that the rebellion was a fever that could be broken by the steady hand of professional military occupation. As the British moved northward from Georgia, they brought with them a sense of inevitable triumph. They occupied key ports, established supply lines, and began to implement a system of governance intended to restore the old colonial order. For a moment, it appeared the American Revolution might end not with a bang, but with a systematic restoration of British law. In the towns and coastal enclaves, the British presence was imposing. Redcoats marched through streets that had once been symbols of colonial autonomy, their rhythmic footsteps a constant reminder of the king's reach. They were supported by a growing network of local militias, men who had stayed true to the crown, driven by a desire for stability, property rights, and a rejection of the radicalism brewing in New England. To the British, these men were the silent majority, the bedrock upon which a new, pacified America would be built. However, this momentum was a double-edged sword. The more territory the British seized, the more they were forced to stretch their resources thin. To maintain control over the vast, rugged interior of the Carolinas and Georgia, they had to garrison hundreds of small outposts, leaving their main forces vulnerable to the very people they sought to subdue. While the British celebrated their tactical successes, a different kind of war was brewing in the shadows of their new strongholds. The momentum of the British Empire was heavy, methodical, and visible, but it was also rigid. It relied on the control of cities, the occupation of roads, and the traditional rules of engagement. They were winning the battles of the coast, but they were beginning to lose the pulse of the countryside. As the British moved deeper into the South, they found that while they could capture a city, they could not capture the spirit of a people who had already decided they were no longer subjects, but citizens. The British momentum was at its absolute peak, a roaring wave of imperial power, yet beneath the surface, the friction of a decentralized, irregular resistance was starting to create a turbulence that no amount of professional infantry could fully suppress. The empire was winning the war on paper, but the ground beneath their feet was becoming increasingly unstable. Early 1781, the Carolinas. The British momentum, once a roaring wave of imperial certainty, was beginning to encounter a new and exhausting reality. The Southern strategy had reached a critical inflection point. While the British held the coastal strongholds and the major towns, the interior of the Carolinas had become a labyrinth of partisan warfare and relentless harassment. The British High Command realized that to truly break the rebellion, they could not simply sit in their coastal fortresses. They had to strike deep into the heart of the countryside and dismantle the continental presence that still flickered in the hills. This necessity set the stage for one of the most sophisticated strategic maneuvers of the entire war. The task of neutralizing the Southern rebellion fell to Major General Nathanael Greene, a man who had learned the hard lessons of the war's darkest days. Greene understood something that many of his predecessors had ignored. You do not have to win every battle to win a war. You only have to keep your army alive while making the enemy's victory too expensive to maintain. Greene's arrival in the South signaled the beginning of a high-stakes game of chess played across hundreds of miles of rugged, unforgiving terrain. He faced a formidable opponent in Lord Cornwallis, a commander of immense talent and even greater aggression. Cornwallis was a man of the old school, a professional soldier who sought decisive, crushing victories. He wanted a grand confrontation, a single, massive battle that would shatter the American forces and end the conflict in one stroke. But Greene refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead of meeting Cornwallis in a head-on clash, Greene began a masterful campaign of strategic retreat and calculated movement. He understood that the British were operating at the end of a long, fragile supply line, while his own forces could draw strength from the local populace and the vast, difficult landscape. Greene began to lead Cornwallis on a grueling chase, pulling the British army deeper and deeper into the interior, away from their naval support and their secure coastal bases. This was the race to the south, not a sprint, but a calculated, exhausting marathon. Greene's strategy was to bleed the British army white. He would engage Cornwallis with small, sharp strikes, inflict damage, and then vanish into the woods before the British could regroup. He was trading space for time and territory for the enemy's exhaustion. As the two armies moved through the Carolinas, the landscape itself became a weapon. The heat, the swamps, and the endless marches took a heavy toll on the British regulars. For every mile Cornwallis gained, his men grew more tired, more hungry, and more isolated. The British were winning the skirmishes, but they were losing their vitality. They were being drawn into a trap of their own making, a trap where the prize was not a decisive victory, but a state of total depletion. The race was on. On one side, the relentless, heavy momentum of the British Empire, seeking a final, glorious conclusion. On the other, the agile, elusive, and increasingly disciplined Continental force, led by a general who knew that survival was the highest form of victory. The stage was being set for a collision that would exhaust the British even as it pushed them toward their ultimate, and perhaps final, mistake. March 15, 1781, near Greensboro, North Carolina. The psychological chess match between Greene and Cornwallis was about to reach its breaking point. For weeks, the British had been chasing a ghost, pursuing a continental army that seemed to dissolve into the Carolina brush every time a decisive blow was struck. But on this morning, the Ghost was ready to stand its ground. Nathanael Greene had chosen his location carefully, a patch of rugged, wooded terrain near the Guilford courthouse. He wasn't looking for a glorious charge. He was looking to create a meat grinder. As the sun began to rise through a thick, heavy mist, the two armies faced each other across a landscape designed for defense. Greene had meticulously arranged his lines in three distinct tiers. The first line consisted of North Carolina militia, men who were often undersupplied and undertrained, but who possessed a desperate, fierce determination to defend their homes. Behind them stood the second line, a mix of militia and Continental regulars, positioned to catch the momentum of any British advance. And finally, deep in the rear, sat the third line, the seasoned, professional corps of the Continental Army, waiting to deliver the final, crushing blow. Lord Cornwallis, sensing that the elusive Greene had finally stopped running, saw this as the moment he had been craving. He ordered a frontal assault, believing that the sheer discipline of the British regulars would shatter the American lines like glass. The battle began with a terrifying intensity. The British regulars surged forward, their bayonets gleaming in the dim light, crashing into the first line of American militia. The fighting was chaotic, visceral, and incredibly bloody. The militia fought with the ferocity of men backed into a corner, inflicting heavy casualties on the British before they were finally overwhelmed and forced to retreat. But as the British pushed into the second line, the momentum began to falter. The terrain, broken by thickets and uneven ground, slowed their advance. The Americans used every tree and every ridge as a shield. The air was thick with the sulphurous smoke of musket fire and the screams of the wounded. Cornwallis's men were winning the ground, yard by yard, but the cost was becoming astronomical. Just as the British appeared poised to break through, Greene's trap snapped shut. The third line, the professional Continental regulars, stepped forward. They met the exhausted British advance with a disciplined, rhythmic volley of fire that turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. For a moment, it seemed the Americans might actually break the British army. Yet the outcome of the battle was a paradox that would haunt the British High Command. In the heat of the struggle, the American lines eventually buckled under the sheer weight of British professional infantry. Technically, Cornwallis held the field. He had driven Greene from the courthouse. But as the smoke cleared and the sun climbed higher, the true nature of the victory revealed itself. Cornwallis looked at his ranks and saw a devastating toll. His victory had cost him nearly a third of his force. His elite troops were shattered, his momentum was gone, and his supplies were dwindling. Greene had lost the battle, but he had achieved his strategic masterpiece. He had bled the British army white. Cornwallis had won the ground, but in doing so, he had lost the capacity to hold the South. The chase was far from over, but the British momentum had finally, irrevocably, broken. August 14, 1781, the Chesapeake Bay. While the blood was still drying on the fields of North Carolina, a different kind of warfare was unfolding hundreds of miles to the east. Lord Cornwallis, battered and depleted by his encounter with Greene, had made a decision that would prove to be his fatal error. Seeking a way to resupply his starving army and escape the relentless pressure of the American interior, he began a slow, arduous march toward the coast. His destination was Yorktown, a peninsula on the Virginia coast that offered a deep-water port and a chance to regroup. Cornwallis believed the sea would be his lifeline. He assumed that the Royal Navy, the undisputed masters of the ocean for centuries, would be waiting to protect his flank and secure his escape. He was wrong. While Cornwallis looked toward the horizon for British sails, the eyes of the American Revolution were fixed on the movements of the French. For years, the alliance between the fledgling United States and the Kingdom of France had been the lifeline of the rebellion, but it had largely been a war of supplies, money, and distant skirmishes. Now, it was about to become a war of decisive naval confrontation. The arrival of the French fleet was not merely a reinforcement, it was a total transformation of the conflict's geometry. Under the command of the brilliant Admiral Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse, a massive armada of 28 ships of the line, the heavy hitters of the Age of Sail, was steaming toward the American coast. These were not mere transport vessels. They were floating fortresses, capable of matching any British squadron in a direct engagement. The strategic landscape shifted overnight. Previously, the British Navy had used its superiority to blockade American ports and move troops with impunity. But de Grasse's arrival introduced a terrifying new variable, the possibility of naval parity or even French dominance. As the French ships moved into position, the trap began to close. The intelligence flowing between the American commanders was frantic and vital. George Washington, coordinating from the north with the Marquis de Lafayette, and Nathanael Greene, still maneuvering in the south, were all racing toward a single point on the map, Yorktown. But the race was not just against time. It was a race against the wind and the waves. The entire outcome of the American Revolution now rested on a singular, high-stakes gamble. If the British Navy could intercept de Grasse, Cornwallis would be saved, and the rebellion might finally be crushed. But if the French could seize control of the Chesapeake, they would do more than just support the Americans. They would effectively sever Cornwallis from the rest of the British Empire. The Atlantic, once a highway for British reinforcements, was about to become a cage. As the French sails appeared on the horizon, the war ceased to be a colonial insurrection and became a global struggle for supremacy. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, where the heavy iron of the French Navy would decide whether the American dream would live or die. September 5, 1781, the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. The gamble had been taken and the ocean had spoken. In a thunderous, smoke-choked engagement known as the Battle of the Capes, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse did the impossible. They outmaneuvered and drove back the British naval squadrons. For the first time in the war, the Royal Navy was denied the sea. The lifeline Cornwallis had banked his survival upon was severed. He was no longer a general waiting for support. He was a prisoner waiting for the walls to close in. By the time the first American and French boots hit the soil of the Virginia Peninsula, the trap was set. The siege would not be a solitary American effort, but a masterpiece of international cooperation. On one side, the Continental Army, battle-hardened and desperate for a final victory. On the other, the professional, disciplined French expeditionary force led by the Comte de Rochambeau. Together, they moved with a synchronized precision that the British had never anticipated. As the lines of the siege began to form, the atmosphere at Yorktown turned from anticipation to claustrophobia. Cornwallis's men, once the pride of the British Southern campaign, found themselves squeezed into a shrinking pocket of land. To their back lay the water, now dominated by French masts. Before them lay a tightening ring of trenches, redoubts, and heavy artillery. The siege was a brutal, slow-motion symphony of iron and earth. Day and night, the air was filled with the deafening roar of cannon fire. The French and American engineers worked tirelessly, digging zigzagging trenches known as parallels, inching closer and closer to the British fortifications. Under the cover of darkness, these trenches crept toward the enemy lines, bringing the heavy guns within striking distance of the British works. But the war was not just being fought with gunpowder. It was being fought with hunger and exhaustion. Within the British lines, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Supplies were dwindling, and the stench of disease and decay began to hang heavy over the camp. The psychological weight of the siege was as crushing as the bombardment. Every morning, the British awoke to find the enemy's guns closer than they had been the night before. The climax arrived in the early hours of October 14th. In a daring, midnight assault, American and French troops stormed two critical British redoubts, fortified positions that anchored the defense. The fighting was hand-to-hand, frantic and bloody, conducted in the shadows of bayonets and musket flashes. When the sun rose, the redoubts had fallen. The British defenses were breached, and the path to Cornwallis's main camp lay wide open. The realization was inescapable. There was no escape by sea, and no relief coming from the land. The momentum of the revolution had become an unstoppable force. On October 19, 1781, the silence that fell over Yorktown was more profound than any cannon blast. As the British marched out to lay down their arms, the surrender of Lord Cornwallis signaled more than just a lost battle. It signaled the end of the British dream of a pacified America. The siege was over, the fighting had effectively ceased, and the world would never be the same. October 19, 1781, Yorktown, Virginia. The morning air was heavy, not with the sulphurous stench of gunpowder, but with an eerie, suffocating stillness. For weeks, the rhythm of Yorktown had been defined by the roar of artillery and the frantic digging of trenches. But today, the guns were silent. The violence had been replaced by a ritual of profound humiliation. As the clock ticked toward the appointed hour, the British forces began their long, slow march out of their fortifications. They were not the triumphant conquerors who had arrived in the South. They were a broken remnant. The drums beat a rhythmic, somber cadence, and the soldiers marched in formation, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a campaign that had ended in a cul-de-sac. They were moving toward a makeshift stage set up on the outskirts of the camp, a place where the reality of their defeat would be codified in ink and ceremony. General Charles Cornwallis, the man who had once commanded the momentum of the British Empire in the American colonies, was conspicuously absent. In a move that would be debated by historians for centuries, he had sent his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, to deliver the news. Whether it was due to illness, injury, or a desperate attempt to save face, the absence of the commanding general added a layer of bitter irony to the proceedings. The commander of the British forces would not even stand to face the men who had broken him. The scene was a study in international tension and military formality. On one side stood the victors, the Continental Army, led by George Washington, and the French expeditionary forces under the Comte de Rochambeau. They stood as a unified front, a living testament to the alliance that had turned a colonial rebellion into a global struggle. On the other side, the British regulars, their colors drooping, prepared to yield. When the formal surrender was announced, the weight of the moment settled over the field. As the British officers handed over their swords, it wasn't just a transfer of steel. It was the surrender of an empire's authority over a continent. The articles of capitulation were read aloud, detailing the terms of their withdrawal. The British were to be disarmed, their artillery seized, and their presence in the peninsula extinguished. For the Americans, the atmosphere was a volatile mix of jubilant relief and stunned disbelief. For years, they had fought not just for territory, but for the very right to exist as a sovereign people. The surrender at Yorktown was the ultimate validation of their sacrifice. The ragtag militia and the starving Continentals had, alongside their French allies, brought the greatest superpower on earth to its knees. Yet, even as the cheers began to erupt and the celebratory bells rang out in the distance, the seasoned leaders knew the truth. This was a military conclusion, not yet a political one. The British Crown would not relinquish its claim to the colonies simply because a general had lost a siege. There would still be debates in Parliament, negotiations in Paris, and the long, arduous task of building a nation from the ashes of war. But as the sun climbed higher over the Virginia coast, one thing was undeniably certain. The back of the British military effort had been broken. The revolution had survived its darkest hours, and the path to independence, once a narrow and treacherous trail, was now an open road. October 19, 1781, Yorktown, Virginia. The silence that followed the surrender was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a vacuum. As the British troops marched away toward their ships, a profound and unsettling question hung over the American camp. Now, what? The military catastrophe at Yorktown had shattered the British will to continue the fight, but it had not yet dismantled the British Empire's legal claim to the 13 colonies. For the men who had spent years shivering in frozen trenches and marching through scorched forests, the war felt over. But for the politicians in Philadelphia and the diplomats in Europe, the war was merely entering its most dangerous phase. The battlefield had been won, but the peace was yet to be negotiated. This transition created an immediate and chaotic political vacuum. The Continental Congress, which had served as a makeshift government throughout the conflict, found itself presiding over a collection of states that were less a unified nation and more a loose, fractious confederation of sovereign entities. The authority of Congress was tenuous at best. It could request funds, it could suggest laws, but it could not enforce them. There was no central executive to lead, no national treasury to stabilize a collapsing economy, and no unified voice to represent the new interests on the global stage. The economic reality was equally grim. The war had left the colonies in a state of financial ruin. The continental currency, once printed in massive quantities to fund the struggle, had become virtually worthless, a phenomenon known as hyperinflation that left soldiers unpaid and merchants destitute. Debts were mounting, trade was disrupted, and the specter of bankruptcy loomed over the newborn states. The very people who had fought for liberty now found themselves struggling for basic survival in a landscape of scarcity. Furthermore, the social fabric of the colonies was torn. The revolution had been a civil war as much as a war for independence. Loyalists, those who had remained faithful to the crown, now faced a terrifying, uncertain future. Thousands were being stripped of their property, facing exile, or enduring the wrath of neighbors who viewed them as traitors. The question of what to do with these enemies within became a festering wound that threatened to reopen the scars of combat. In the halls of power, a new tension began to emerge between the need for order and the fear of tyranny. The revolutionaries had fought to escape the heavy hand of a distant monarch, yet they were now realizing that, without some form of centralized strength, their new independence might lead to nothing more than anarchy. The radicalism that had fueled the rebellion was clashing with the pragmatic need for stability. As the news of Yorktown rippled across the Atlantic, it sparked a firestorm of debate in the British Parliament. Some called for an immediate withdrawal, others demanded a more vigorous pursuit of colonial submission. The fate of the American experiment now rested on the delicate machinery of international diplomacy. The victory at Yorktown had provided the breathing room, but it had not provided a blueprint. The Americans had successfully destroyed an old system, but they had yet to invent a new one. They had broken their chains, only to find themselves standing in a vast, empty wilderness, tasked with the monumental burden of building a civilization from the ground up. The war of arms was ending. The war of ideas was just beginning. September 3, 1783, Paris, France. If Yorktown was the military death knell of British rule, then the halls of the French capital would become the courtroom where the legal life of a new nation was finally decreed. For nearly 2 years following the surrender at Virginia, the world had existed in a state of suspended animation. The fighting had largely ceased, yet the map of the world remained unchanged on paper. The American colonies were, in the eyes of international law, still rebellious provinces of the British Crown. To transform a rebellion into a nation, the Americans needed more than just a battlefield victory. They needed a signature. The task of securing this recognition fell to a small, unlikely trio of American diplomats: Benjamin Franklin, the venerable elder statesman; John Adams, the prickly and relentless New Englander; and John Jay, the shrewd legal mind. They arrived in Paris not as representatives of a recognized power, but as agents of a movement. Their mission was a delicate diplomatic tightrope walk. They had to negotiate with the British, who viewed them as traitors, while simultaneously managing their French allies, who were often more interested in weakening Britain than in ensuring American prosperity. The negotiations were grueling and fraught with tension. The British, desperate to salvage some semblance of honor and protect their global interests, sought to limit the scope of American expansion. They wanted to keep the new nation contained, fearful that a sprawling American empire would destabilize the balance of power in the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the Americans were playing a high-stakes game of brinkmanship. They knew that Britain was exhausted, but they also knew that the French and Spanish were watching closely, waiting to see if the Americans could truly stand on their own. The breakthrough came not through a single moment of brilliance, but through a series of calculated concessions and strategic maneuvering. The Americans, particularly John Jay, realized they could not rely solely on the French to advocate for their interests. They had to negotiate directly with London. This move stunned the French, but it allowed the American delegation to bypass the complex web of European alliances and strike a deal that favored their specific territorial ambitions. The resulting document, the Treaty of Paris, was a masterpiece of diplomatic triumph. For the United States, the terms were staggering. Great Britain formally recognized the 13 colonies as free, sovereign, and independent states. But the victory went far beyond mere recognition. The treaty established massive new boundaries, extending the American frontier from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Mississippi River, and from the Great Lakes in the north to the Floridas in the south. It secured fishing rights off the coast of Canada, and granted the new nation the right to navigate the waters of the West. In a single stroke of the pen, the map of North America was rewritten. A collection of 13 disparate colonies had been transformed, by legal decree, into a continental power. The treaty provided the essential legitimacy the Americans had craved since the first shots were fired at Lexington. However, as the diplomats prepared to return home, The euphoria of victory was tempered by a sobering reality. The treaty had defined the nation's borders, but it had not yet defined its character. The legal war was won, but the struggle to govern this vast, new empire was only just beginning. December 1783, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The ink on the Treaty of Paris was barely dry, and the euphoria of independence was already being met by the cold, hard machinery of reality. For years, the American people had been united by a singular, powerful purpose: the destruction of British tyranny. But once the common enemy was gone, the glue that held the 13 colonies together began to dissolve. The question was no longer how to win a war, but how to exist as a country. At this moment in history, the United States was not a unified nation in any modern sense. It was a loose confederation of 13 sovereign entities, each acting like a small, jealous republic. They had their own currencies, their own trade restrictions, and their own competing interests. To manage this delicate collection of states, they relied on the Articles of Confederation, a document that had been drafted during the heat of the war and finally ratified in 1781. The Articles were born from a profound, almost paralyzing fear of centralized power. Having just fought a bloody revolution to escape the perceived tyranny of a distant king and a heavy-handed parliament, the Founding Fathers were terrified of creating a new American version of the very thing they had just overthrown. Consequently, they did not design a strong central government. They designed a government that was intentionally, almost pathologically, weak. Under the Articles, the national government was little more than a glorified committee. There was no president to enforce the laws. There was no national court system to settle disputes between states. Most critically, there was no power to tax. The Continental Congress could request money from the states to pay off the massive war debts incurred during the Revolution, but they had no authority to demand it. They were essentially a beggar at the door of their own states. This structural impotence created a domino effect of chaos. Because the central government could not regulate interstate commerce, states began engaging in bitter trade wars, slapping tariffs on one another and creating economic chaos. Because there was no unified national currency, the economy was a fractured landscape of depreciating paper money. On the global stage, the United States appeared less like a rising power and more like a collection of disorganized squabbles, making it nearly impossible to negotiate favorable trade deals or command respect from European empires. The most dangerous flaw, however, was the matter of defense. Without the power to raise a standing army through taxation, the nation was vulnerable. The central government could not ensure that the borders defined in the Treaty of Paris would actually be respected or defended. The 13 states were like 13 separate ships sailing in the same direction, but with no captain, no shared rudder, and no way to coordinate their movements. As the 1780s progressed, the cracks in this foundation began to widen into chasms. The dream of a unified American identity was being smothered by the reality of 13 competing identities. The Articles of Confederation had succeeded in its primary goal. It prevented the rise of a domestic tyrant. But in doing so, it had inadvertently created a vacuum of authority, a vacuum that threatened to pull the entire American experiment into a state of permanent collapse. The Revolution had succeeded in breaking the chains of Britain, but the new nation was now finding itself struggling to find the strength to stand on its own 2 feet. 1786, Western Massachusetts. While the political elites in Philadelphia debated the nuances of diplomacy and trade, A far more visceral and desperate crisis was erupting in the rugged hills of New England. This was not a war of grand ideologies or sweeping declarations. It was a war of survival, fought by men who had bled for independence only to find that liberty did not put bread on the table. To understand the explosion of violence that was about to occur, one must understand the crushing economic reality of the post-war era. The revolution had been won, but the cost had been astronomical. Farmers, many of whom had served in the Continental Army, returned home to find their livelihoods in ruins. They were saddled with massive debts, often denominated in hard specie, gold and silver, which was vanishingly rare in a collapsed economy. To make matters worse, the state governments, desperate to pay off their own war debts, were aggressively collecting taxes. For a farmer in the Massachusetts backcountry, the math was impossible. If he couldn't pay his taxes or his debts, the courts would seize his land. If he couldn't pay his creditors, he would be thrown into debtor's prison. For these men, the very government they had fought to establish had become a new source of oppression, one that felt just as predatory as the British Crown ever had. In August of 1786, the tension finally snapped. Led by Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army, a militia of aggrieved farmers began a series of armed protests. They didn't target the British. They targeted the courthouse. They marched on local jurisdictions, forcibly preventing judges from sitting and ensuring that no more foreclosure proceedings could take place. The movement spread like wildfire. These were not professional soldiers, but they were men who knew how to fight, and they were driven by a profound sense of betrayal. They saw themselves not as rebels against the law, but as defenders of the very principles of liberty they had been promised in 1776. They believed that a government that could take a man's land without recourse was no government at all. As the Shaysites moved toward more strategic targets, including the federal arsenal at Springfield, the central government's impotence was laid bare. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress was powerless to intervene. They had no national army to send, no funds to raise, and no authority to command the Massachusetts militia to act. The state of Massachusetts was forced to rely on a privately funded militia, essentially a mercenary force, to suppress the uprising. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but the damage to the American psyche was permanent. Shays' rebellion served as a terrifying wake-up call. It proved that a government too weak to tax was a government too weak to maintain order. It demonstrated that without a central authority capable of regulating the economy and enforcing the law, the liberty the revolution had won would descend into anarchy. The smoke from the skirmishes in Massachusetts signaled to the Founding Fathers that the Articles of Confederation were not just flawed, they were fatal. The era of experimentation with a weak confederation was over. The era of the Constitution was about to begin. May 25, 1787, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The echoes of gunfire in the Massachusetts backcountry had not yet faded, but in the humid halls of the Pennsylvania State House, a different kind of storm was gathering. The delegates arriving in Philadelphia were not coming to fix the Articles of Confederation. They were coming to replace them. What began as a modest mission to revise the existing framework of government had, almost immediately, transformed into a radical attempt to reinvent the American experiment from the ground up. As the heavy doors were closed and the windows shuttered to ensure absolute secrecy, the atmosphere inside was one of immense gravity. These men, architects of the revolution like James Madison, diplomats like Benjamin Franklin and the indomitable George Washington understood that they were standing on a precipice. If they succeeded, they would create a stable republic. If they failed, the fragile union would dissolve into 13 bickering, bankrupt, and potentially warring microstates. The debate was not merely a legalistic quarrel. It was a collision of fundamental philosophies. On one side stood the advocates of a strong central authority, men who feared the very mob rule they had seen during Shays' rebellion. They argued that without a powerful federal government capable of taxing, regulating commerce, and maintaining a standing army, the United States would be nothing more than a collection of vulnerable territories, ripe for exploitation by European powers. On the other side stood the defenders of state sovereignty. They were haunted by the specter of the British Crown, fearing that a centralized government would inevitably become a new tyranny, distant and indifferent to the needs of the people. They saw the power of the states as the only true safeguard of individual liberty. The tension reached a breaking point over the most fundamental question of all: how should power be distributed? The large states demanded representation based on population, while the small states feared they would be swallowed whole by their larger neighbors. The solution, the Great Compromise, would create a bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives to satisfy the people, and a Senate to protect the states. Yet, even as they built this intricate machinery of checks and balances, a dark shadow loomed over the proceedings. The delegates were tasked with defining the people, yet they conspicuously avoided the question of slavery, choosing instead to protect the interests of the southern states through the Three-Fifths Compromise. It was a Faustian bargain, a political architecture built on a foundation of human bondage that would, decades later, tear the nation apart in a much more violent struggle than the one they had just won. By the time the summer heat began to break, the delegates had drafted a document that was nothing short of revolutionary. They had moved beyond a mere league of friendship to create a federal republic, a government of laws, not of men. They had created a system designed to be slow, deliberate, and resistant to the whims of any single faction. The Constitutional Convention had ended, but the battle for the soul of the new nation had only just begun. The document they had produced was not a finished masterpiece. It was a blueprint, and its legitimacy would be tested in the fierce intellectual fires of the coming years. September 1787, New York City, New York. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry, but the silence of the convention had been replaced by a cacophony of political warfare. The question was no longer whether a new government was needed, but whether the one proposed was a salvation or a betrayal. The American people were being thrust into a high-stakes intellectual battlefield, a struggle that would define the very meaning of liberty. This was the era of the Great Debate, the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. On one side stood the Federalists. These were the men of order, the proponents of the new Constitution who believed that the survival of the American experiment depended on a robust, centralized authority. Led by the intellectual brilliance of Alexander Hamilton, the strategic mind of James Madison, and the prestige of John Jay, the Federalists argued that the previous decade of chaos proved that a weak government was a recipe for disaster. To them, the Constitution was a necessary shield against foreign interference, economic collapse, and the internal anarchy of mob rule. They believed that through a sophisticated system of checks and balances, power could be concentrated enough to be effective, yet distributed enough to prevent tyranny. But as the Federalists pushed for ratification, A formidable opposition rose to meet them, the Anti-Federalists. They were not a monolithic group, but a diverse coalition of small farmers, local politicians, and staunch advocates of state sovereignty. To these critics, the Constitution did not look like a shield. It looked like a shroud for individual liberty. They looked at the sweeping powers granted to the federal government, the power to tax, to raise armies, to regulate commerce, and saw the unmistakable ghost of the British crown. The Anti-Federalist argument was rooted in a profound distrust of distance. They believed that true republicanism could only exist in small, localized communities, where the people could directly hold their leaders accountable. A distant, centralized government in a faraway capital, they argued, would inevitably become an insulated aristocracy, disconnected from the lived realities of the citizenry. Their most piercing criticism was a glaring omission. The Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights. How, they demanded, could a people trust a government that had not explicitly guaranteed their fundamental freedoms of speech, religion, and trial by jury? To win this war of ideas, the Federalists launched a massive propaganda campaign. They penned the Federalist Papers, a series of 85 essays that remains one of the most profound works of political philosophy in human history. Through these writings, Madison and Hamilton attempted to deconstruct every fear of the opposition, explaining the intricate mechanics of the new government, and arguing that the very complexity of the system was its greatest protection. The debate raged in taverns, in newspapers, and in state legislatures. It was a struggle that forced every citizen to ask, how much liberty are we willing to trade for security? How much power can a government hold before it becomes an enemy of the people? In the end, the Federalists would prevail, securing ratification through sheer political maneuvering and the promise of a Bill of Rights to appease the critics. But the victory was bittersweet. The debate did not end with the signing of the document. It merely established the fault lines of American politics. The tension between federal authority and individual liberty, between national unity and state autonomy, would become the permanent, pulsing heartbeat of the American Republic. 1791, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. With the ratification of the Bill of Rights, the immediate fires of domestic dissent began to dim, but the smoke of the Revolution was far from cleared. The American experiment had moved past the era of muskets and bayonets, entering an era of institutions and ideologies. As the new government began to breathe, the world watched with a mixture of awe and profound skepticism. Could a republic, born of violent upheaval and founded on the radical notion of popular sovereignty, actually endure? Or was it merely a brief, flickering candle in the long night of human history? The legacy of the Revolution was not a static monument, but a living, breathing, and often contradictory force. It was a paradox written in the very fabric of the new nation. On one hand, the Revolution had codified the Enlightenment ideals of natural rights, equality, and the consent of the governed. It had dismantled the divine right of kings and replaced it with the rule of law. It had inspired a generation to believe that the structures of power were not inevitable, but were things that could be built, dismantled, and remade by the hands of the people. Yet the Revolution's legacy was also shadowed by the profound contradictions of its inception. The same men who penned the words, "All men are created equal," lived in a society where the institution of chattel slavery remained deeply entrenched, a moral rot that the new Constitution had failed to excise. The promise of liberty was extended to the landed elite and the burgeoning middle class, but for the enslaved, the indigenous populations, and the disenfranchised. The revolution had often been a change of masters rather than a liberation of souls. This tension, between the soaring rhetoric of freedom and the grim reality of inequality, would become the central, agonizing struggle of the American story for centuries to come. Beyond its borders, the impact of the American Revolution was seismic. It acted as a political earthquake, sending shockwaves across the Atlantic. The successful defiance of the world's greatest imperial power provided a blueprint for revolutionaries in France, Haiti, and Latin America. It proved that the old order was not invincible. The concept of a written constitution, a social contract that defined the limits of power, became a standard for modern nation-states. The American Revolution had not just created a country, it had launched a global era of constitutionalism and decolonization. As we look back from the distance of centuries, the legacy of the American Revolution is best understood not as a finished masterpiece, but as an ongoing argument. It was a revolution of the mind as much as a revolution of arms. It bequeathed to the world a set of questions that remain unanswered. How do we balance order with liberty? How do we ensure justice for all while protecting the rights of the few? How do we build a more perfect union in a land of infinite disagreement? The war was won on the fields of Yorktown, but the revolution, the struggle to live up to its own ideals, continues to this day. The echoes of 1776 do not reside in the past. They reside in every debate, every protest, and every attempt to expand the boundaries of freedom. The American Revolution did not end with a treaty. It began a journey that the world is still traveling.